Prime Minister Justin Trudeau continues to hold the line and reject calls for the federal government to intervene and put an end to Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou's extradition.
As a democracy, as a country that encourages freedom of expression, there are always going to be different perspectives on what a government should do and how a government should do it. I very much respect those eminent Canadians, even as I disagree with them. But I think it is a hallmark of a strong and free society that we can have big debates about really important issues, while at the same time a government can be absolutely unequivocal about our approach to this issue.
The Prime Minister is answering another question there about a letter from 19 prominent Canadians earlier this week, including a former Supreme Court Justice, a former Attorney General, 3 former Foreign Affairs ministers, as well as others. They all penned that letter pushing for Meng's release. They argue it could end the now more than 560-day detention of Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton told my colleagues at The Current this morning that U.S. President Donald Trump was willing to cut a deal to drop the charges against Meng in exchange for a trade deal with China. So should that factor into the decision-making here? Let's bring in U.S. foreign policy analyst Ian Bremmer. He's the president of Eurasia Group. Hi, Mr. Bremmer. Good to see you again.
Hi, good to be with you.
So there's this mounting pressure on the Prime Minister in this country coming from some unlikely sources, former diplomats, former foreign affairs ministers in Canada, to put an end to the extradition proceedings for Meng Wanzhou in order to try and secure the release of those 2 Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who have been detained now for more than 560 days in China. What do you think of the idea?
Well, they are hostages. China has no right to hold them. There is no rule of law. There are clearly no crimes that they have committed. And so they need to be let go. And the Canadians have been protesting this in the strongest possible terms. The Americans should be doing the same for Canada. But there is literally no chance that Prime Minister Trudeau is going to let Meng go, that he's going to interfere in that case. And essentially fold to Chinese blackmail. This has happened before, as I'm sure you know, back after the 2015 election with the Philippines. You had the kidnapping of 2 Canadians, and Trudeau's position, like the American position, has been that Canada would never pay ransom because it would make the Canadians a target for others abroad. And in fact, one of those kidnapped was actually murdered in a pretty gruesome manner when Trudeau refused. And I don't see this, frankly, as any different. I think it's inconceivable to me that the Canadians would back down and would interfere in a legal process to give in to Chinese blackmail. And I think it's extraordinary that you'd see this many respected Canadians actually make the argument that the Canadian government should fold on this. I'm quite surprised by it.
So setting aside those Canadians, there's another one, the wife of Michael Kovrig, who is essentially saying this is something, please consider it, because there are no other options being put forward. We interviewed her last night, and she really doesn't see another way for her husband and Michael Spavor to be released. I think she came across as completely understanding the potential ramifications and the complexities of it. She's worked in international relations as well for a long time. But it's that feeling, I think, and I'm not trying to put words in her mouth, but it's almost a feeling of desperation, right? Like, what else will get China to actually release these 2 people? On that, what do you say?
Well, it breaks your heart. This is family, and I don't care if she has an international relations background. She's talking about her husband. And so, of course, I remember Michael Dukakis when he was asked, well, what if your wife was raped? Would you support the death penalty then? And he acted like an academic saying, no, it's still a principled position. No, but your wife, you want to kill the guy, right? So I'm completely understanding that, what she has had to go through for a year and a half, the emotional desperation. We've seen these horrible, heartfelt notes that have been written by the Canadians being held hostage. Of course, she should be calling for Prime Minister Trudeau to intervene. I'm a human being. How can we not feel sympathy for that? But Trudeau has to be in the position of being a statesman. He is not just responsible for the two Michaels. He's responsible for the well-being of all Canadians, and not just today, but going forward. And it would be incredibly irresponsible for him to give in to those emotions and set aside the broader responsibility of governing Canada, which he has done before and which I have no doubt he will do again. He will do the right thing here, as painful as it is.
Let me ask you about the American component to all of this, because, you know, I'm sure you're well aware of John Bolton's book and all that's described in it. What he clearly lays out in this case is that the president was willing to essentially cut a deal to package dropping everything against Meng Wanzhou in exchange for a trade deal with China. So much of, what the Canadian effort here is obviously because of the warrant from the United States and also our obligations under the extradition treaty to the United States. How does that factor into it? What can we expect, if anything, from this administration on this file, do you think?
Well, I mean, if you start judging Canadian governance standards on the basis of the Trump administration, you're going to have a very different conversation. And I think very few Canadians would support that. So I don't think that's where you want this discussion to go. It is certainly true that Trump plays by a different rule set. I mean, as I said at the opening, I think the Americans should be providing a lot stronger support for their allies. They should be coordinating their policy on China with their allies, who have done a lot with the United States, the Canadians, the Australians, the United Kingdom. I mean, the Chinese act with impunity against smaller countries, knowing that they have power advantages, and also knowing that the United States isn't doing very much for them right now. But again, the real point here is that Canada actually is a representative democracy with rule of law. You have a process by which this case is being assessed, and extradition is assessed, and you are not intervening. You're going by the judicial process, and that is what one would expect any Canadian government to do. And the fact, I mean, if you had asked me about the efforts of Trump to get the Ukrainian government to investigate Joe Biden, and of course he was impeached but not convicted for that. And if you then ask me, well, shouldn't Trudeau start doing the same thing? No, that should not affect the way any other leader should behave, not even other American leaders. I would be strongly opposed if Biden were to behave that way, or Obama. We just happen to have a president in the United States who does not think or utter the idea that, no, I could not do that because it would be wrong. You would never hear him say that. So the constraints on Trump's behavior have much more to do with what you prevent him from getting away with, the balance of powers, the rule of law, the structural integrity of American political institutions. It's not about the president himself. But in the case of Canada, whether it's a liberal or a conservative PM, I feel quite confident that the decisions would be made in very similar ways.
Likely so. Thank you, Mr. Bremmer. Appreciate your time and insights as always.
My pleasure.
We're also getting reaction now to that letter from Justice Minister David Lametti. He says he's seen the letter penned by 19 high-profile Canadians, but insists he will not intervene in the extradition case of Meng Wanzhou before the court process ends. He made those comments to my colleague, Olivia Stefanovic, who joins us now with more on them. Hey, Olivia, great to see you. Take us through what the minister said about that prospect, that possibility of intervention.
Well, Vashi, this is the first time we're hearing from the Justice Minister and Attorney General since this letter that you mentioned was sent to his office by 19 former parliamentarians and senior diplomats calling on the minister to release Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou to facilitate perhaps the release of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who have been in Chinese detention now for more than 560 days. The minister says he's seen this letter and he expresses sympathy for the families of the two Michaels, but he says he's waiting to see how the court process plays out, the court process involving Meng Wanzhou. And at the point where the court may decide to extradite Meng Wanzhou, the minister can decide to do an independent review, and that's when Lametti says he will step in. Here's more of what he had to say.
In order to best ensure that we not only respect the rule of law, we respect our treaty obligations, and we respect the rights of any accused person in that system, we have therefore created or put into place a structure that leaves the mechanisms to the court system until the final surrender, at which point I would step in. And because I might have to step in at the point of surrender, it is best for me not to have any comment on that. That being said, and I've said this publicly, I am well aware of what my powers are under the law.
I want to ask you about that last point that Lametti made, that the minister made, Olivia, because that's really the crux of what has transpired over the week. That legal opinion that came out, supported by Michael Kovreg's wife, supported by those 19 Canadians, was that timeline that the minister lays out, where he can only intervene after everything has been completed in the courts, is wrong. They say that he can intervene really at any point. He could right now. Was he aware of that? Like, what did he say specifically about that?
Yeah, I did put that question directly to the minister, asking him if it's his understanding that he can intervene in the extradition process at any point. Let's take a listen to how he responded.
That's Section 23 of the law. We have constructed a system so that we avoid political issues, and so it would be inappropriate for me to comment further.
And Vashi, Lametti's position is gaining support. There was another letter issued today by, it was published on the Macdonald-Laurier Institute think tank, and it was signed by 33 high-profile Canadians, and it's urging the Prime Minister not to release Meng Wanzhou. They say that this would not lead to the release of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovreg. They say this would, in fact, send Canada into hostage diplomacy. This letter was signed today, Vashi, by Canada's the former head of Canada's intelligence service, Ward Elcock, and former Conservative cabinet minister, Christopher Alexander. And they say that a prisoner exchange is not the way to go. They call it, quote, the antithesis of these vital aims. And instead, what they want the federal government to do is apply sanctions to the Chinese officials who are keeping Michael Kovreg and Michael Spavor locked up.
Okay, great information. Thanks a lot, Olivia. I look forward to seeing the rest of your interview. The CBC's Olivia Stefanovich.
As a democracy, as a country that encourages freedom of expression, there are always going to be different perspectives on what a government should do and how a government should do it. I very much respect those eminent Canadians, even as I disagree with them. But I think it is a hallmark of a strong and free society that we can have big debates about really important issues, while at the same time a government can be absolutely unequivocal about our approach to this issue.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says it's not dissension, but democracy at work. That's how Trudeau is describing the disconnect between his stance on the Meng extradition case and that of at least 19 prominent former politicians and diplomats. They called on him earlier this week to drop the case in order to secure the release of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovreg, two Canadians detained in China for now more than 560 days. As you heard, he's soundly rejected that option. So what happens now? Time for the Power Panel. Marie Vastel of Le Devoir joins us. Senior writer for Maclean's, Paul Wells, is with us too. And Sherelle Evelyn, managing editor of The Hill Times. Hi, guys. Great to see you.
Hi.
Paul, I'm going to start with you because I know you did a lot of digging into how this letter came about and what the point of it is and how this group of people, and I should mention for our audience, even though we've been covering it a lot, just so they're reminded, you got people like former Conservative Foreign Affairs Minister Lawrence Cannon, Louise Arbour, former Supreme Court Justice Alan Rock, former Justice Minister, Liberal Justice Minister. What is the genesis of all of this, do you think? And politically for the government, what does it mean?
Well, there's a lot of people who have been working full-time to try and get Spavor and Kovreg released, and probably nobody among them more than Dominic Barton, the newly appointed federal ambassador to Beijing, who has been given a lot of latitude to improvise and try things. And so when he greeted a delegation of prominent Canadians last November in Beijing, who had come to do a few things, try and pick up business ties and other things, he also talked to them about possibilities, options, ways of getting these two prisoners released. And that delegation included John Baird, the former Conservative foreign minister, and Alan Rock, the former Liberal Justice Minister and Health Minister. And he didn't tell them what to do, but he said, maybe you could look into options. And frankly, there aren't a lot of options. Either you keep Meng and you prosecute her, or you try the extradition case in court, or you let her go and see if that helps. And sure enough, a few months later, Rock and Louise Arbour, both of whom have worked with Michael Kovrig in the past, came up with the option of letting Meng go. And that has become, was already and has become quite a popular option among a certain class of prominent, eminent Canadians. And a bunch of them signed that letter the other day.
Sherelle, what do you think that argument has done to the case that the government has been making for months now about doing the exact opposite? Like, has this had the effect of undermining Justin Trudeau's argument, or has it made it look stronger?
I think it might have actually made the case look stronger, because it's now given the Prime Minister this platform to come out really forcefully in a way we actually haven't seen on many topics for a while. The Prime Minister getting really passionate and about something, and really trying to drive home the fact that, you know, if we go down this road and do what the signatories to the MLI letter said, you know, this prisoner exchange, we're putting all Canadians in a worse position. So while it's incredibly hard and difficult for the families of the Michaels and for the Michaels themselves to be detained, you know, he's almost kind of given himself this look as, you know, as a very hard line. I know what I'm doing, and I have this other group behind me to back me up.
And that's especially pertinent, I think, maybe when you look at the domestic interplay of it all, Marie, because the criticism actually here in Canada of the Prime Minister has not usually been go easier on Meng Wanzhou or go easier on China. It's coming from the Conservatives who say you're too weak on this file, you're not tough enough on China.
Which also helps his position, right? The fact that Andrew Scheer himself says that this so-called prisoner exchange idea is a bad idea. It's not the first time that it was suggested. I remember John Manley suggested it, as the Globe reported last year. And then again, the Prime Minister excluded it. But I think the difference was, and the good thing now, is that he's actually explaining why he thinks it's not a good idea. And as was said, he's explaining that that's because it would put a lot of people in danger. And even when that idea was suggested a long time ago, you already had academics and previous ambassadors to China like David Mulroney or Guy Saint-Jacques saying, no, we shouldn't give in to what they called hostage diplomacy. Their point being that China doesn't like to deal with people who they judge as being weak, and that Xi Jinping has been more aggressive in political affairs and foreign affairs, and we shouldn't cave. I think it's also worth noting that, yes, Minister Lametti has the power, the discretionary power to intervene, but there is a memo that the Canadian press put their hands on and wrote a story about today, saying that discretion has very rarely been used in the past 10 years, and never has it been used for political or diplomatic reasons. So while that power does exist, it's not like it's been invoked on a regular basis in the past, which also, again, gives the Prime Minister, I think, more bolsters the Prime Minister's position on this.
Yeah, it's interesting, Paul, because we had Alan Rock on the show when he first came, before the letter, but when he first came forward with the proposition, and I had asked him, well, when you were Justice Minister, did you ever do what you're saying that this Justice Minister should do? And he said no, but he also contended that no extradition case that crossed his desk had the sort of details or parameters or impact that the one that currently exists with Meng Wanzhou and Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig does. As far as, I think, Paul, what I see are genuine follow-up kind of questions for the Prime Minister after he makes all these statements come from, for example, Michael Kovrig's wife, who says, okay, if not this, then what else? A number of questions to the Prime Minister this week about, okay, are you going to revoke visas for students then? Are you going to sanction Chinese individuals? And there was no affirmative answer there. There were no specifics really, at least relayed this week, about how they're going to back up this very specific position they've taken this week.
Yeah, the signatories of this letter may not be obviously correct in their choice of strategy, but they're not fools. And they point out a big true thing, which is that while we're stuck trying to get these gentlemen out of prison, Canada essentially has no China policy and can have no China policy. It can't lead in criticism of, for instance, the treatment of Hong Kong. It can't lead in criticism of the Uyghurs, because the hope is that if the Trudeau government is firm but otherwise inoffensive, then at some point the Xi Jinping regime might get tired of the hassle and let these guys go. And so the question is, if you're not going to capitulate and let Meng go, and if you're learning with every day that passes that the policy you've been pursuing for 2 years is useless in getting these guys out, then will you escalate? And exactly, the former diplomat Colin Robertson and others have said, what about simply revoking the visas of every Chinese student in every university in Canada? What about, as Amir Attaran has suggested, revoking the flight permission for Chinese airlines over Canadian airspace? These are extraordinarily harsh tools, but short of that, what's been happening hasn't worked. And so the question rises: if you simply want to look tough but be ineffective, then continue on the policy you've got. But if you want to be effective, then it might be time for a new policy.
And like I said, Sherelle, there wasn't necessarily a specific answer from the Prime Minister who said we're ruling it out forever or we're actively considering it. He did put an emphasis on work that's being done behind the scenes. He keeps saying that they're working very hard, and I don't know the reality of it. I'm sure that they are. And I should be fair, Michael Kovrig wife certainly is convinced that the government is committed to doing what they can behind the scenes. But in the absence of any of that information being public, there isn't a whole lot that we know about what this government is willing to do, at least to back up that rhetoric.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of asking to take it on faith that, the government is doing everything they can. I know there was reporting this week about, former politicians, I believe John Baird was one of them, going over to China in the last couple years and trying to work behind the scenes and pull some of those strings. We won't know what's going on until hopefully Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor are released. But there is precedent with, Canada working with other foreign governments to get Canadians who have been detained or in rough situations back home. So there is precedent there, but obviously the fact that it is, I guess, really keeping a really even keel on the public face of it's obviously difficult and perhaps disheartening for some people who want to see action and want Canada to look like it's doing something.
Final word to you, Marie, on that prospect of another country helping us. We got some cold water thrown on that by John Bolton this week in his book when he writes about Donald Trump basically willing to make a deal about Meng Wanzhou with China for a trade deal, but ultimately backing away from that because of the circumstances surrounding it. Certainly, we can't pin our hopes on the U.S. coming to our aid, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think we can rarely pin our hopes on Donald Trump, given that he's a bit unpredictable. But yes, that being said, the government does keep saying that they did get support from a lot of other countries who are supposedly bringing up Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig's fate when they have discussions with the Chinese. Hopefully that is still going on, though it hasn't necessarily provided any results so far. I would add, though, you're right, that we sort of have to trust them at face value when they say they're doing a lot behind the scenes. I think the tricky issue here is that we don't really have the big end of the stick. And as we've seen in previous months during our dispute with China, if they decide to impose commercial sanctions, trade sanctions to some of our industries like pork exports or canola exports, we do end up being the ones who really feel the brunt of it and them not so much. So I think the government is also probably very conscious that as much as they would like to have a harsher tone on China, I think they're trying to measure what they can do that would actually bring results for Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, but not necessarily make things worse and leave them in prison any longer.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.